So for fun, I decided to watch all of the Best Picture nominated Oscar movies of the year and rank them from best to worst, starting with the 2021 batch. We're finishing with the worst, in my opinion, but we're leading with the best. So my favorite film from the 2021 Best Picture Oscar nominees is Nomadland. With a Frances McDormand who clearly has no fear of being typecast, Nomadland is a visually engaging, incredibly directed, and introspective look at boomers, at a time when it's not too popular to be one. Roughing it, sometimes out of necessity after financial crisis, across the country in a nomadic lifestyle, or glorified American poverty, depending on how you view it. So to make it clear, this is my personal top pick for Best Picture and Best Director in Chloe Zhao. I should note that hearing the media buzz around the director and the awards she was already snatching up for this movie before I saw it, I was worried that it might have been overhyped, let's say, which wouldn't have been surprising because many voices perhaps inadvertently argue that sex or race should play a factor in who's nominated or wins, and alleges that it's already the case, citing disparity as the proof in and of itself. But the really funny tell is that these voices rarely argue for parity in the less flashy and prestigious fields, yet they disconcordantly expect it as a matter of course for the highest positions available, and while that'd be nice, they'd also settle for being nominated at least double the rate of men from now on to give the illusion of parity in the directing field. So the hilarious part is, it's not equality to men, it's equality to the top 10% of men in terms of recognition. But despite that observation, not only was Nomadland my favorite of the Oscar movies this year, it's number 11 out of 44 on my Letterboxd favorite movies of all time as of this video. You could argue that it drags in the second half, but it's not a road trip adventure movie. Living out of your van isn't seen as fashionable as tiny house living, but it's still an option or necessity for some people. And one of the questions this film raises for me is, what makes a home? Just because you might be houseless doesn't mean you're homeless. And to that end, I'd say that this is a movie about home, where it is, what it is, and who it might be with. Sound of Metal. I may have had more fun with other movies on this list or found more intrigue in others, but out of all of the nominees, Nomadland and Sound of Metal are the only two movies on this list that I'd still watch 25 years from now. Riz Ahmed turning in a great performance as a drummer who starts to lose his hearing and struggles to come to terms with it. The film's incredibly sparse score and on-the-nose original song meant that somewhat fittingly it wasn't nominated in either category, but it did get a nod for sound design. As for the acting award, if Chadwick Boseman were still alive today, Riz Ahmed would have had a decent chance of winning Best Actor. The Trial of the Chicago 7. Perhaps the most intentionally funny movie on this list while still balancing drama, The Trial of the Chicago 7 is based on the 1969 trial between the federal government and 7 activists of various backgrounds. You have Sacha Baron Cohen as Abby Hoffman doing shtick, Mark Rylance as a wise-ass lawyer, Frank Langella as a mind-bogglingly awful judge, Yahya Abdul-Mateen's son as Bobby Seale, a Black Panther that gets briefly and bizarrely swept up in the trial, Jeremy Strong, who I've never actually seen in anything before, Michael Keaton as Michael Keaton, Eddie Redmayne playing Tom Hayden, the unofficial leader of the 7, and while an ideological comrade to Cohen's Hoffman, an opponent on their approaches to change. You can tell the film wants to be considered more topical than it really is at times, and somewhat similar to Judas and the Black Messiah, it does gently smooth out the far left edges of some of these characters to make them more palatable to a mainstream American audience. It is a harrowing showcase of the late 60s government's attempt to control the national conversation around Vietnam by scapegoating 8 men. But unfortunately, this trial happened to 7 white men, and oh boy is that not in vogue. Oh my god, the banal and poor faith criticism that popped up in response to this film is even more in poor taste when you consider that this trial is one of the few times, actually, the system targeted white guys for their contribution to social justice, throwing the book at them to make an example, and more broadly, signal white liberals into submission. That was the entire point of the trial. That's why barely involved academics were also charged. So instead of desperately trying to edit the defendants out of the trial that happened to them, maybe a film about a sham political trial could be from the perspective of, I don't know, the defendants that were actually in it? I'm just spitballing. The emotional core of the movie is about protesting the atrocity that was the Vietnam War, and the young Americans being sent to kill and die for terrible reasons. That's everyone's concern, but no, the film doesn't take a moment to focus on the plight of black veterans. I mean, Defy Bloods came out 3 months before this movie, which is literally all about black Vietnam vets, And you could play the same reductive game with this movie. These black men almost certainly had mothers who underwent worse systemic oppression pre-civil rights era. So why doesn't the movie fill its running time with their even more marginalized stories in a race to the bottom? When all is said and done, I'd definitely give the win to Sorkin for original screenplay. I haven't watched much of his work, but he clearly takes writing very seriously. And just because some people may wish the story were different, this isn't the same as saying the current story is poorly executed. Minari. I could tell this was going for best score in like the first minute, and I'm just gonna say it. I think Alan Kim as Little David should have been nominated for Best Supporting Actor. I'd swap out Paul Rassi, but that's just me. He wouldn't have had to win, but nominating him would have been more than a stunt to generate some interest, as I mostly was genuinely convinced that he was a kid. It didn't feel like he was acting, it felt like a real adorable kid, as opposed to a kid trying to act adorable. I'm pleased that Yoon Ye-jung wasn't overlooked for Best Supporting Actress. She had a good arc in this movie and played it well. It was very interesting to see an Asian American story like this, a family that picks up and tries to build a home in a strange land, but that strange land is 1980s Arkansas. And also there's an okay farming plotline, I guess. It's a very simple story, but done well. The film doesn't pretend that their neighbors were colorblind, but it also doesn't bathe in racism tropes to fill up time, create drama, or otherwise make up for a lack of an actual story to tell. Instead, the film has emotions and conflict that derive from and revolve around something other than the actions and existence of white people. And the opposite is usually a trap that many supposedly progressive movies fall into. Minari is probably a better movie than Chicago 7, but the lower entertainment value for me is why it's one below. The Father. When I say intrigue, this is what I'm talking about. You'll discover quickly that the father employs the unreliable narrator tool to a chilling perfection. Anthony Hopkins shines in this role as Anthony, a man struggling with Alzheimer's disease, a degenerative memory condition in case you didn't feel like Googling it, while his daughter is moving away and trying to get him into a facility. As someone who's dealt with dementia and Alzheimer's in their family, this personally resonates with me, particularly the performance by Olivia Coleman. Trying to put the pieces together and figure out what's real and what's delusion makes what otherwise might be just a depressing film a bit of a thriller. Given the importance of set design in this movie and how it related to storytelling, I would have liked to see a nomination in that category. However, I'll settle for both of the acting noms it did get. Judas and the Black Messiah. Judas and the Black Messiah is a semi-biopic about Fred Hampton through the perspective of FBI informant William O'Neill, who infiltrated the Black Panthers. Now, full disclosure, I'm black, and the reason why this film is lower on my list is due to the underlying historical revisionism. There's surface level stuff like how we don't know who shot first in this confrontation in real life, but in the movie, the black guy can't shoot first, right? So because the movie's stuck with the actual documented results, we end up with this bizarre display of expert marksmanship that still allows the Panther to be the victim in this circumstance.
Yes, I bet you have.
Then there's the FBI. The portrayal of the 1960s FBI in recent years has been interesting, to say the least. To its credit, the movie does scratch the surface of the Black Panther Party's socialist and also overtly revolutionist rhetoric, which in case you didn't know, would really put them on the FBI's poopy list. But what made them nationally threatening in the eyes of the FBI was their muddying the waters between black liberation and Marxism and anti-capitalism. With racial sympathies as an entry point and a rainbow coalition, white liberals and the black population at large could be drawn into far-left ideology, and it was one of the more likely and insidious ways that communism could take root in the United States. But before you sneer at that, please remember that lots of people think that half their country is on the verge of becoming Nazis because they voted for the second of the two major parties. The most basic sense of perspective might suggest that someone could feel the same concern about the left inching towards its extremes. And regardless of how you may feel about communism, it was persona non grata, effectively synonymous with domestic terrorist. So take someone like MLK. He has the power and persona to unite the black community, and his gentle approach could appeal to white liberals. He's disavowed communism, but privately he was a socialist. That's a red flag to them. One of his aides, Jack Odell, is, or at least was, an actual communist. That's a big red flag. Stanley Leveson, who was reported to fundraise for the Communist Party until 1957, is like many of King's associates, a staunch leftist. In separate hampers, but cut from the same cloth, you had Malcolm X, an actual communist, and oh, Fred Hampton, a socialist, and by one left-wing writer, a communist. You see where I'm getting at now? So with all that in mind, it would kind of be very surprising if they weren't keeping eyes and ears on these people. They shouldn't just trust that they're cool dudes under no influence from foreign governments and that the revolution they all keep talking about won't cause untenable unrest. Like, no! One of their main jobs is preventing domestic revolution, like it or not. I could do an entire video on this alone. I'm not saying the FBI or Hoover are the good guys. We're devoid of racial and political prejudice, or that the state never does anything bad. But it's an incredibly simplistic take to pretend that race was the only reason the Black Panther Party and other black groups were on their radar alongside white power groups. Though I'd be remiss if I didn't clearly state that for most of the activists, black civil rights were the main or only goal, and red baiting was used to hinder those goals. Personally, I did enjoy seeing Hampton's goal of uniting people beyond the barriers of race in his Rainbow Coalition, and I did find the film entertaining. I don't think I'd give Daniel the Oscar for this one, but he did a good job. Mank. In 1930s Hollywood, screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz finishes the script for Citizen Kane while being drunk all the time. Mank is not a bad movie, it's just not my movie. This comes below Black Messiah only because there's just not as many good conversations that can arise while watching Mank, at least for me. Even though I appreciated the, albeit unexpected, political discussion, like most of these old Hollywood send-ups, they never actually look like old movies, as it'd be too expensive and impractical to procure all of the antiquated and obsolete technology that made and limited those films. I'd say it was a very interesting choice having Gary Oldman, a 63-year-old man, play a guy who jumps between 36 and 43 in the movie.
Your age should be justified in wanting out.
Oh, I'm 43, but that's very understandable.
I think it's a fine film. I don't have much to say about it. I just feel like it really won't be talked about as much as the years go on. And in last place, in case you didn't deduce it yet, oh girl, here we go. Promising Young Woman. This was the 5th out of the 8 films we watched, and man, it was disappointing. I was praying that the first 2 minutes of the film were a dream sequence, because the dialogue was straight out of a bad episode of Law & Order SVU, and I say that as someone who's watched every episode of Law & Order SVU. I had thought throughout a decent portion of the movie that, like The Father, it had an unreliable narrator. Spoiler, it doesn't. It's played straight.
You know, they put themselves in danger, girls like that. And if she's not careful, someone's gonna take advantage.
Promising Young Woman stars Carey Mulligan as Cassandra. Probably not the titular character, but still the main character, and on a revenge quest. Maybe more. At the start of the movie, it seems pretty straightforward. You've heard of apartheid, but that has nothing on being a 20-something white woman dating in Wisconsin. Getting into spoilers, the scene where Cassandra sets up an old college friend played by Alison Brie to be raped was shocking to me. It pulled me out of my seat and I was genuinely becoming interested in this character. At this point in the movie, I figured that Cassandra has been raped, and so traumatically that it must have mentally broken the character. Now she's so twisted that she's getting revenge on the women who betrayed her or knew what happened to her but said nothing. She has no love for them, only hate, and thus has no issue subjecting them to the worst thing she's ever experienced. Then she sneakily abducts a teenage girl who's revealed to be the daughter of a college dean, taking the girl to a frat house where both Cassandra and Dean Walker take it as an inevitability that a girl will be raped there in order to extract a complacency confession out of the dean. My eyes were glued to the screen to learn more about Cassandra. I was torn between wanting to see her succeed her plan of revenge or not because it's such a sick thing to do. The trauma of Cassandra's own rape destroying her empathy as she embarks on a misguided vengeance quest would have been a fascinating character, unique, dark, and if there's a movie centered on someone like this, let me know. This would also fit into the unreliable narrator interpretation that explains why every man she meets is a loser rapist in waiting, helped rapists, or is a rape witness and apologist. I'm not joking when I say this is a film that misinterprets the 1 in 3 women statistic to mean that 1 in 3 men are abusers, and that the other 2 men are probably in on it too. The paranoia could almost have been Hitchcockian if it were paranoia, but instead it's all real. The movie has the unenviable task of having to visually represent an amalgamation of lady locker room talk and blog sphere confessions. And putting it to screen can't help but appear as absurd, similar to that shooting in Black Messiah actually. But it turns out that no, Cassandra was not raped and then been an edge case who had her psyche torn by it and became this challenging and original character. Instead, she's avenging a friend who was raped, and Cassandra is just such a devoted friend and good human being, and that alone is what's motivated her. I was so worried for a minute there. She didn't set people up to be raped, she used deception to make them think rapes had happened and then told them the truth later, because again, she's ultimately a good person. Cassandra's an anti-hero, a subdued Harley Quinn, but she's not a villain or portrayed as one, and avoids being so challenging that the film might have risked the praising accolades it's gotten. And we can't have that now, can we? So anyway, that was my ranking of the 2021 Oscars Best Picture nominees. A lot of it's just my opinion, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with me on a placement. You're probably coming from a different perspective than me, so I'd be curious to know what it is, and I'm glad I could share mine. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, share, and have a good one.